1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we see how, as 1945 drew to an end, the world was to change shape forever. Millions of people were forced to move home and country as borders were redrawn and new occupying governments installed. The wartime trials at Nuremberg in November aimed to mete out justice to the Nazi leadership. By the end of the year, America and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a new Cold War. The forces which were to shape international politics for the next 50 years took root in 1945. By the autumn of 1945, the Second World War was over. Germany and Japan had been defeated, but at an unimaginable cost. Across the world, 55 million people had been killed. The use of the atom bomb against the Japanese people had changed the very nature of warfare itself. Defeated countries were under the military and political control of the victors, with no idea when this would end. Germany was divided into zones controlled by America, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. By August, Japan was occupied by the Americans alone. Countries across the world had been devastated by the war, and although the victors were concerned about global security, reconstructing their economies at home was a major priority. Only America had escaped the war unscathed.
The mainland United States had not been invaded, had not been attacked, nothing had happened. So its industrial position was unimaginable. In a sense, it was way up there, and everyone else was down here.
Between 1940 and 1944, American industry had grown by 50%. America was now the richest country on earth, and its citizens had the highest standard of living by far. The country truly was the economic powerhouse of the world.
The United States had had a good war. This was a war that had returned prosperity to the American people, that had restored the American people's faith in capitalism and abundance, in their sense that the American dream was still alive, that the prospects for the future never looked brighter. What had happened during the war was that people had been earning higher wages than they'd ever had before. Employment was full. Even people serving the army were earning wages of a scale that they couldn't have imagined before the war. And what they'd done with all that money was to save it. And so there was a tremendous consumer spending boom in the end of 1945 and into 1946. And Americans were going out and buying cars and buying radios and buying new homes. There was also great geographical mobility within the United States during the war, a migration on an unprecedented scale of African Americans from the South into the great industrial cities of the North, where the jobs were during the war. And that, of course, was to have a profound impact on American society after the war.
Black Americans in the South still lived in a society segregated by race, and many returning black soldiers found they had fought fascism and racism abroad, only to face it themselves when they got home.
There was no big fanfare on coming home, though it was good to see my family. Prejudice was just the same as before the war, but instead of anger, I focused on finishing my education. I went to postgrad school and got my master's, but when it came time for applying to the major corporations, I was in for a shock. Though I got interviews, it was my white counterparts that were offered the jobs, some of whom I had assisted. Despite being better qualified than most, and my contribution to the nation as a combatant soldier, the options for me as an African American were not wide enough.
There's no doubt that the experience of African Americans during the Second World War sowed the seeds for the future civil rights movement.
A movement which was paralleled in the British Empire as demands for independence in India and elsewhere grew to a clamour. But it was, however, an empire which Britain could ill afford. As the only country which had fought all through the war, Britain was victorious, but bankrupt. For the British people, life in peacetime was to be a bitter continuation of wartime deprivations.
In a perverse way, the British predicament at the end of the Second World War was the worst, because while the Germans had a profound sense, not of guilt, but of defeat, they knew they'd lost, the British thought they'd won. Everyone had imagined there would be an exultation about victory, but in the end, when they actually stood among the rubble of the Blitz and the rockets in England and the poverty of a nation that had bankrupted itself, that somehow it all seemed terribly disappointing. And somehow the two latecomers to the Second World War, the Russians and the Americans, both of which had not joined in as a matter of principle, but only because they were attacked, had come out as top dogs.
Millions of British troops were demobbed by the end of 1945. They came home with high expectations, which all too often were severely dashed.
For a soldier coming back to his family, it was obviously a joyful reunion up to a point. He was often a stranger to his children. His wife had had to find ways of coping and being independent during the war, which had, in a sense, excluded a husband. A man had been living in an entirely male environment where his life was very structured for him. He suddenly had to come back, readjust to his home life, find a job, demobilization in an austere, decaying, devastated country. I think it was an extraordinarily difficult time.
For women too, the adjustment was difficult. For many, the freedom of their wartime years was over.
The divorce rate rose hugely after the Second World War. It had been around 10,000 in 1938, and it rose to over 25,000 in 1945. 70% of that was for adultery. And what was a change was, of course, for the first time, more women were suing for divorce than men.
The main material demand was for more housing, as millions of homes had been destroyed by bombing. Food and clothing were also in short supply, and rationing of some basic goods continued right up until 1954.
After the war, there was a terrible housing shortage. I lived in 2 rooms in an aunt's house. We had a bedroom and a room with a sink and a stove, and we had use of the bathroom. My friend lived in even smaller rooms. She was terribly excited that she could buy a new saucepan. There was such a shortage of everything. Another aunt was eventually housed in a brand new prefab which looked just like a cream and green trimmed doll's house. Rationing went on for a long time after the war. You couldn't buy furniture. You had to buy utility furniture, which was very cheap wood put together to make chests of drawers and tables, and you even had to have coupons for that.
In July, the hope of a better, fairer world had swept a Labour government to power under the leadership of Clement Attlee.
The harsh reality of Britain at the end of the war was that although there were enormous expectations of the Attlee government, there were expectations of a better society, expectations of an end to poverty, but Attlee was dealing with a near-bankrupt nation, dreadfully in hock to the Americans. The economic problems of creating a new society were absolutely enormous.
Undaunted, on the 12th of October, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, made his first budget speech. This outlined Labour's vision for the future and paved the way for the nationalisation of industry and the creation of a welfare state and national health service.
This is the programme on which we were elected. This is the programme we intend to carry out. And my job as Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer is to find the money to do all these things properly.
An awful lot of people were saying to the Attlee government, well, yes, it's all very nice to have a fairer society and social security and decent education and health, but not now because we're bankrupt. And Attlee, of course, knew that now was the political opportunity. Now was the only time. If it wasn't going to be now, it was going to be never.
The Soviet people had paid a very high price for winning the war. 1 in every 10 had died, and thousands of towns and cities were leveled. Whole rural districts were destroyed, and farming had practically ceased.
In the Soviet Union, which had taken a disproportionate share of casualties, some 27 million killed overall, large numbers of men were dead, so a huge burden focused on women. If you look at the statistics, the population after the Second World War, the imbalance between men and women is quite extraordinary. The Soviet Union, in fact, had no resources to throw into reconstruction because everything in Western USSR had been completely destroyed, and the effort they'd put into winning the war had been inordinate.
Looting and black marketeering were rife, and social order had virtually collapsed.
Stalin quickly opted to restore the old system of controls in the USSR. He was going to reconstruct the country, not by making concessions to popular opinion. He knew that if he did this, it would be seen as a permanent weakening of the old system. And he saw his own power and the party's power as essential for the maintenance of the USSR as a global power.
The struggle for global power between Stalin and the other world leaders was to have a profound impact on the millions of people whose lives had already been changed forever by the war. The victors wanted peace, but on their own terms. The price that the people of Europe were to pay was ethnic cleansing on a vast scale. The autumn of 1945 saw the dawn of a new post-war era. America had the most powerful economy in the world. The Soviet Union was a global power, but like Britain, it had been financially crippled by the war. The process of reconstruction was to be long and painful. After 6 years of war, the victorious Allies were keen to create the foundations of a stable and peaceful world. Their big fear was that a war would be provoked by a series of ethnic conflicts, particularly in those European countries where German people were living.
There were many millions of ethnic Germans, German-speaking people, who lived right across Eastern Europe and who'd done so, in many cases, for decades, if not centuries. And the existence of this kind of patchwork quilt of German minorities right across Eastern Europe, up along the Baltic, into Russia, down the Volga, and so on, was something which the Western Allies and the Soviet Union considered had been a major impulse towards the Second World War and a major cause of atrocities during the war. It's important to remember that the Nazi plan for Eastern and East Central Europe had been one of total ethnic reordering, in which the Jews who lived there were to be exterminated. Up to 30 million Slavic inhabitants were to be allowed in the longer term to die of starvation or to be worked to death. And ethnic Germans who lived there or who lived in Germany itself were to be moved in, moved around, and put in charge of large farms which would be worked by slaves from the local population. And without that kind of background, it's very difficult to understand the hatred and bitterness which the local Czechs, Slovaks, Poles and others felt towards ethnic Germans.
The policy of ethnic transfer, what we now call ethnic cleansing, was well established before the war ended. As Stalin's Red Army moved west, ethnic minorities were removed to eliminate conflict or dissent. In late July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, this policy got the official stamp of approval. Churchill, Stalin and Truman backed the mass deportation of ethnic Germans from their homes across Europe, including those living in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary.
Potsdam delineated a new map. It redrew the boundaries for many of the countries of Eastern Europe. The big change occurred with the moving of Poland westwards. The country was moved across so that it gobbled up a piece of Germany, but it released a piece of its own territory to the USSR. So various territorial redrawings took place, and while these were being done, ethnic cleansing also took place.
Before the war, a third of Poland was made up of Ukrainians, Jews and other different nationalities. By 1948, 95% of its inhabitants were Polish Catholics. While the Soviet Union looked after the transfer of populations in the Ukraine and Poland, Britain and America organized the transfer of ethnic minorities in the West.
One saw after the war something on the order of 12 million people traveling from one part of Europe, often their homes for generations, to another part because they happened to share ethnicity. Perhaps not history, perhaps not tradition, perhaps not for generations had they been there. Nevertheless, they were forced to go.
My family lived in Karlsbad in the Sudetenland. One day, all German women and children were told to pack a few things. My mother, siblings and I were taken to a camp. Then we were ferried in dark cattle trucks to West Germany. There we were sent to another camp until we ended up in a tiny village in the area of Thüringen. From here I walked every day for an hour through the snow to work in a toy workshop. I had to earn money for us to eat. My employer felt sorry for me. He told me to look for work in a local family instead. So I found a job helping a woman in the house. She said, let's give it a try for a month. On the 28th day, I was so frightened that I would have to leave the next day. I began to weep. But they told me I could stay, and I lived there for the next 2 years.
It was a dreadful period for the Germans in particular, who were fleeing with just what they could take into their hands, into the new Germany, where they weren't welcomed. For the Poles who were dumped in Silesia, they could move into German houses. But there was a lot of wreckage in the new Poland, and the task of economic reconstruction was only just beginning. So for very, very large numbers of people, the war had been bad enough, but the immediate post-war period was almost as bad.
Millions of people were forcibly removed from their homes, 12 million of whom were Germans. And the borders of Europe were literally redrawn beneath their feet. It became a continent primarily of ethnically separate countries. The exception was Yugoslavia. Its wartime nationalist resistance had grown into a massive political force. By the end of the war, it had captured enough states to create the new country of Yugoslavia under the leadership and control of General Tito.
Josip Broz Tito, the strong man of the partisan movement during the Second World War, the resistance movement that fought the German occupiers, actually had to construct a Yugoslavia which brought together a variety of different nationalities to create a bigger territorial entity, the state of Yugoslavia, but it was based on multi-ethnicity. It was based on the idea that you can pull together a variety of different ethnic groups, and slowly these people will believe in a Yugoslav nation and start calling themselves Yugoslavs, which made it completely different from the other states in the region.
Both Stalin and the West were irritated by Yugoslavia, fearing that it threatened stability in Europe. The West feared a communist state in the region. Stalin hated a communist state which he did not control. Until his death in 1980, Tito managed to withstand both external and internal pressure on the boundaries of Yugoslavia. But in the 1990s, his dream of a multi-ethnic society collapsed into bloody civil war. Stability in Europe was not the only ambition of the Allies. They wanted global stability as well, defined spheres of influence, and the resolution of disputes through dialogue and negotiation, not through a Third World War. Even before victory was secured, Churchill and Roosevelt had started to talk about the rules and institutions which would be needed to maintain peace and security when the war was over.
The project for reshaping the international order began in August 1941 when Churchill and Roosevelt met in Newfoundland and concocted a document called the Atlantic Charter. It's a very short document. And it basically proposed a new world order, a world order based on rules, and premised on three basic foundations. Firstly, that states would be subject to limits on the use of force. War would be outlawed. Secondly, states would respect the dignity of the human individual, and that was how international human rights law was born. And thirdly, states would subject themselves to a system of economic liberalization, free trade, and all the related market-type mechanisms which we're now rather familiar with. And it more or less put in place the system which we still have today.
The Second World War was obviously a turning point in America's not only views of the world, but of her place in the world. The U.S. did not want to be involved in yet another world war, and to prevent that, they had to try to, in a sense, not only be part of the world, but to try to reconstruct the world in a way that this would obviate the need for war. And the main forum for this was going to be the United Nations.
The structure of the United Nations was hammered out by the Allies during the war years. Every nation was to be represented, and its mission was to maintain peace, with the use of force if necessary. But the use of force was to be decided not on a majority vote, but by the much smaller Security Council.
There had been a lot of negotiation. The question, was there going to be a veto in the Security Council? Who was going to be members? How did you join the United Nations? What were going to be the powers of the General Assembly as opposed to the Security Council? And eventually what happens is that negotiations, give and take, came up with an organization each of the great powers could live with.
The United Nations Charter was ratified on the 24th of October 1945 by 51 countries. But the ultimate power rested with the permanent members of the Security Council: the Soviet Union, America, Britain, France, and China. Even today, these five remain the only members of the United Nations top table.
You members of this conference are to be the architects of a better world. In your hands rests our future.
The Allies now moved on to holding the Nazis to account, with the creation of the world's first international war crimes tribunal. By November 1945, a World Peacekeeping Council, the United Nations, had been created. Europe was being reshaped into single ethnic states. But the future of Germany in the New World Order had still to be agreed. None of the Allies wanted a resurgent, aggressive Germany in the heart of Europe.
Germans were still living in a very miserably poor situation where there was still a lot of bomb damage to be cleared up, although the effort to clear up bomb damage under the supervision of the Allies started almost straight away and was carried out particularly by women, so-called rubble women, who cleared away the rubble. They were living in conditions where currency was losing its value and where the black market, which had already begun under the Nazis in the later years of the war, reached epidemic proportions.
Germany was a major problem for governments because there was virtually nothing left, and what they didn't want to do was to recreate what they had seen before. The job was to rebuild Germany, but to punish the Nazis.
To denazify Germany, the Allies had to identify those who had been active in the Nazi regime and those who were in effect fellow travelers.
Thousands and thousands of Germans were forced to fill out very lengthy and elaborate forms detailing what they'd done and what they belonged to in the Third Reich, and were subjected to interviews. It's an unprecedented operation on an enormous scale, trying to establish the exact degree of complicity of an entire population in the crimes of its former regime. And according to the way you were actually placed on this list of hardline Nazi all the way down through fellow traveller down to not being involved, you were then given or denied opportunities to have a job, earn a living, enter the professions, take up your previous profession. And of course, this very quickly became the object of a great deal of political manoeuvring, as people who had been very heavily implicated in the regime tried to get testimonies to convince the denazification tribunals that they'd in fact only been fellow travellers, or fellow travellers that they'd really not been involved at all. There's a lot of evidence that Nazism had penetrated more deeply into the mentality of younger Germans than it had amongst older ones. The Allies mounted a massive re-education programme with new school textbooks, with an attempt to find teachers in schools who would be committed to democratic values, with radio programmes, films.
After the war, Russian soldiers moved into our town. At the cinema, we were shown films of the release of prisoners from concentration camps. My parents, I, and everyone I know were absolutely horrified. Anyone closely connected with the Nazi Party was removed from their jobs. I don't know if my father was a member of the Nazi Party, but a lot of people were. They had to be. The husband of my mother's best friend was a teacher. He lost his job and was cutting wood to make money. People did what they could to survive. Lots of people left, and I thought we had to go as well. But father said no, we should stay. He was a children's doctor and was needed to work in the hospital. He also had to look after the Russian soldiers and their wives, so he and we were pretty much left alone.
The leading participants in the Nazi regime faced a different fate.
Initially, Churchill, and Stalin too, had thought simply of shooting Hitler and the leading Nazis insofar as they survived the war out of hand. But they were persuaded eventually that it would make a lot more sense and perhaps have a more educative effect and, of course, emphasize the rule of law, which had suffered so badly in Nazi Germany, if they put them on trial before an international military tribunal.
So what was envisaged was to create an international tribunal which would exercise jurisdiction over individuals for illegal war, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. There was also a broader project of denazifying Germany, showing the entire population that what had happened was not acceptable, showing that when individuals breached established standards of human behavior, they would be punished.
Nuremberg was chosen as the site of the trials because it had been the place where the Nazis had held their annual party rally right through the Third Reich, and so to come to have a symbolic importance as the national centre of National Socialism.
Before 1945, there were no rules of international law which generally prohibited violations of fundamental human rights, or which stopped one state from using military force against another state, or which dealt with global trade or foreign investment or finance. The general position was that under international law, a state was free to do whatever international law didn't expressly prohibit it from doing. So if there were no clear rules on something, a state was free to act. There were no rules on genocide, there were no rules on extermination of large parts of your population, and states were free in international law to do that. They had to draft rules from new, and that has always dogged the Nuremberg system, because it meant that the rules which were applied to events occurring after 1939 didn't exist when the events actually occurred. And that's why Nuremberg has always been referred to as victor's justice. They drafted the rules, they adopted the rules after the terrible events had happened.
Despite all the difficulties and uncertainty about how to bring the Nazis to account, the trials began on November the 20th, 1945.
However unsatisfactorily and imperfect the Nuremberg trials were, they were a real attempt to impose a code of justice upon a regime that had brought unspeakable misery upon the world.
24 leading Nazis were tried at the first Nuremberg tribunal. 11 were sentenced to death, and the rest imprisoned.
The trials are very widely publicised. They were filmed, they were shown in newsreels. They were seen very much as a way of educating the German people in the criminal nature of the regime that they'd been living under since 1933. But this only had a limited effect, I think. You can't change a people overnight. And although these efforts were very widespread and very seriously undertaken, there was a growing belief amongst Germans that they too had been victims of the war. And many Germans saw the war crimes trials as something rather vindictive.
Many other smaller trials of Nazi collaborators were also held.
There was a trial of doctors who'd been involved in medical experimentation in the camps. There was a trial of lawyers who'd been involved in the perversion of justice and the meting out of death sentences for trivial offences and many other things. There was a trial of big industrialists. There was a trial of leading SS officers implicated in the mass shootings and extermination of Jews.
Over 1,700 individuals were tried between 1946 and 1949, with hundreds of Nazis imprisoned or executed for war crimes. But many other Nazis escaped justice.
We may say 60 years on how terrible it was that a lot of evil men escaped to Spain or to South America and so on. That a lot of Western soldiers, they'd had enough. They didn't want retribution. They just wanted peace. Yes, virtually all the top Nazis were caught. Yes, as many of the architects of the concentration camps who could be found were brought to justice. And yes, summary justice was extracted by the Russians in particular. But otherwise, a lot of very bad men slipped away into the cracks of Europe and were never seen again in the West.
In Japan, justice was also pursued by the Allies. Trials began in Tokyo in May 1946 under American supervision. Here, hundreds of Japanese officers were tried for war crimes and crimes against Allied prisoners of war. But many more were to escape justice as the Cold War began to overshadow American international politics. The roots of this Cold War, which would last nearly half a century, could already be seen in the last months of 1945. By December 1945, the shape of the rest of the 20th century was already sketched out. Britain was no longer a world player. America was an economic powerhouse, ready to convert the world to capitalism. And the Soviet Union, while economically weak, was ideologically strong and determined to defend communism.
From being a pariah state, or a sort of rogue state in the 1920s and 30s, to the verge of extinction in 1942, it had sprung back to a position where it was the only power that could effectively oppose and balance the United States on the world stage.
Stalin, at the end of the war, knew that the Americans intended to be the dominant world power. They were setting up military bases, linking up the whole of the world. They were penetrating the political orders in the most powerful countries all around the world. They were using their economic might as a means of increasing their political and military power.
By the end of 1945, the Soviet Union was well on the way to being one of the two superpowers. It did not have working nuclear weapons, but it was working on them and would have them within 4 years.
In August 1949, the Soviet Union ran their first successful atomic test. But the really important weapon for the Americans in their battle with the Soviet Union was their economy. From the Depression of the 30s, America had become the richest country in the world.
At the end of 1945, half of the manufacturing capacity of the world was in the United States. The Americans had an almost complete monopoly over the developing new technologies of electronics and aerospace. The United States was, far from being bankrupt, was a massive creditor nation. It was at the summit of its power.
Certainly the Soviet Union expected the United States to go into a profound depression after the end of the war because it would have no one to sell its surplus production to. And therefore it was to the benefit of the United States that it tried to reconstruct not only countries, but international financial and economic systems to rebuild the world so that its farmers, its producers, its industrialists have someone to sell their goods to.
The Americans wanted new markets, and they also believed that international trade would make war less likely.
Somehow things had to be organized that would not only make war more impossible, but more unlikely because people weren't going to be so concerned with taking people's territories or people's trade and so forth.
During the war, the American and British governments had been planning for a post-war world. They thought free trade and international economic cooperation would prevent booms and slumps and help countries in financial difficulties.
The idea is when you bind economies and make them economically interdependent, it's much more difficult for conflict, for war to break out. That's the logic of free trade, the essential elements of globalization in its modern sense, namely that one state, one community, has an interest in what another community does or doesn't do, was established by the vision of Churchill and Roosevelt.
However, by the end of the war, Britain and America were no longer equal partners, and much of this cooperative sentiment disappeared. One of the first victims was Britain itself. With her gold reserves wiped out, Britain had survived the war by relying on American aid and military and industrial equipment, which was to be paid for later. This scheme was known as Lend-Lease.
Fairly soon after the Attlee government came in, the United States suddenly withdrew Lend-Lease. This was a lifeline to Britain, and it meant imminent bankruptcy. So the only thing that was left for Britain to do was to seek a vast American loan. And there were long and detailed and bitter negotiations.
It was pretty clear to the Americans that Britain was in dire economic shape. The Americans saw the British need for finance as a way of getting the British to accept various policies the United States wanted them to accept, various policies, economic policies, open up the empire to American trade, for example. The British saw this as opening up the empire for American business to take it over commercially. The Americans saw it as freedom for their businessmen. That's one good example of the types of changes the United States wanted to enforce in Britain as a price of the financial aid that Britain so desperately needed.
The vote by the American Congress of the loan to Britain is good news.
The agreement that was finally reached was for a loan, a rather smaller loan than Britain had hoped to get, but a loan nonetheless, enough to stave off immediate bankruptcy.
Britain borrowed £3.75 billion, but on very harsh terms, and it had to be repaid with interest over the next 50 years.
The terms, in effect, meant that there was bound to be a financial crisis in Britain within 2 or 3 years, and the financial crisis, in fact, duly arrived in 1947.
And it forced the Americans to see what they hadn't really admitted before, just how weak Britain was.
Now, of course, the long-term result means both political and economic dependence on the United States, and has ever since. There isn't a single prime minister since Attlee, I suspect, who didn't see America and the American relationship as the only one that really fundamentally mattered. But the reason that that is the case is partly political dependence, but it is partly because we still owe vast sums of money dating back initially to that enormous loan negotiated between Attlee and Truman.
Today, Britain still owes America over £200 million.
Of any other country.
But in 1945, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, was not deterred by the attitude of the Americans. He refused to be deflected from his plans for social reform.
All sorts of things that we now take for granted. The idea that if you're ill, you can go to the doctor. You don't have to count your bank balance and say, oh, I can't afford the doctor. The idea that everybody has a right to secondary education, that dates from the Attlee government. The idea that if you're out of work, you don't starve. There is a basic subsistence level. All of that was creations by the Attlee government. None of it existed before. An awful lot of it does not exist still in vast chunks of the world, including the United States of America.
But at the time, many thought America would follow Britain.
What was happening in Britain seemed to some Americans to be almost self-evidently the way of the future. And they assumed that sooner or later, progressives in America assumed that sooner or later the United States would follow the British example down the path towards a national system of health insurance, federal support for housing and education. The reason why eventually it didn't get anywhere was because the Conservative alliance of Republicans and Conservative Democrats were now bolstered by being able to contrast an American tradition of self-help and individualism and limited government against what was increasingly perceived as the looming Soviet threat.
As American attitudes hardened, their government seized effective control of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both established during the dying days of 1945. The cooperation and support of the war years and the hopes of this continuing in peace was soon forgotten, and Europe was to face years of extreme hardship. Not until after 1945 did America offer substantial support for reconstruction with the introduction of the Marshall Plan.
The United States, through the Marshall Plan, forced these countries, encouraged these countries, facilitated these countries to get rid of these tariff barriers and make it one huge market. This would enable Europe to reconstruct, to become a viable continent again, against the Soviet Union, amongst other things, and also a huge market for all the surplus American grain and tinned meat products and cars and steel, a market for these goods to be sold. So it was a win-win situation for the United States, and indeed for Europe as well.
West Germany, with the help of Marshall Aid, also began to recover, and by the late 1950s, began to boom.
What really made the difference in the end to the way the Germans thought about democracy was the experience of the so-called economic miracle in the 1950s. The economy, thanks to Marshall Aid from the Americans and thanks to many other factors, had really taken off. And it finally became clear to Germans that democracy, in West Germany at least, could deliver prosperity in a way that the Weimar Republic in the years before Nazism had signally failed to do.
In Japan also, America saw the importance of its occupation to ensure both the reconstruction of the country from the devastation of war and the creation of an ally against what they saw as a growing communist threat from China. America ended its occupation of Japan in 1952, by which time Japan had a healthy economy and political democracy. By the end of 1945, the world was dividing into two ideological blocs. The Soviet Union was imposing communism on the countries it had liberated from Germany at the end of the war, while America was extending its political influence in the West. These opposing views would dominate global politics for nearly 50 years.
At the end of 1945, we have a world transformed. You have a United States of unimaginable power, strength, wealth, and influence. You have a United Kingdom that is aware of its weakness, but also aware even more of how much it has to cleave together with the United States, which is one major reason why they, as far as they can, go along with what the United States wants. But you've also got a Soviet Union that, in a sense, has reverted to its pre-war position of being seen as an enemy. So you have a situation where the three allies, for various reasons, have to work together, but maintain a wary distrust. And this made for a post-war world of tension and some danger, and certainly a lot of unexpected outcomes.
As 1945 came to an end, millions hoped that they and their children and grandchildren would never see the like of the last 6 years ever again. There have been wars, terror, and genocide since, but many millions have also experienced relative peace and prosperity.